Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to biology. Our first task today is to define the term biology itself. Like many scientific terms, its origin is in the Greek language and has two constituents, bio and logia. The first term, bio, refers to living things or living matter. So bio is life or living matter. The second term, logi, comes from logia, meaning study of. So biology is the study of living things, or more poetically stated sometimes, study of life. Now it might seem somewhat self-evident to you, but what is a living thing? That's the first question that we must ask ourselves. How do we define a thing to be living? A chipmunk here clearly seems to be living, and you probably agree that plants are living. But this over here, the third picture that you see before you, is a picture of an HIV virus. It's a cartoon picture, of course. But most biologists do not consider viruses to be living things. Clearly, they cause a lot of trouble to the human species. But why is it that so many biologists do not consider the HIV or hepatitis B or hepatitis C or the common cold or the flu virus to be living things? In other words, the first thing that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we actually define a thing to be living? Or what are the characteristics of living things? Well, more formally, if you were to define biology, you would say biology is a set of principles, concepts, theories that allow us to understand the natural environment that's around us. That is, biology is the principle, concepts, and theories that allow understanding of the natural environment. And again, you must ask yourself, what is it about the natural environment that is to be studied? And why is it that we study it? Well, these are all very pertinent and important questions. All knowledge, of course, starts with a certain curiosity. Well, take this beautiful picture before you, for example. From afar, this looks like a very beautiful snow-capped mountains, and there's a little forest over there, and there's a little lake over there, and that looks very nice. And it is. But you must understand, in the forest, which itself is made of trees, which are living things, there are countless deers, perhaps, and bunny rabbits, and innumerable number of bird species, etc., and countless insects and bacteria. And in that lake, there are fishes, and perhaps there are frogs, and there's a couple of ducks here and there. So this picture before you, just beneath the soil and above the soil, is teeming with living things. The question you have to ask yourself, how is it that they manage to live together peacefully? How is it that this whole thing that you before you does not disintegrate into a pile of dead matter? Curiously, how does it not happen so? Well, that is the study of biology. How is it that living things interact with each other? How is it that they coexist in this beautiful world? As a brief overview of the chapter, there are four major topics that we shall discuss. First, what is biology as a definition which we have already defined? The second thing that we shall talk about is, what is it that there is to study about biology? What is there to study? And I shall propose to you that there's certain order and balance that appears to be in nature, and it's not haphazard, that things are not there just because. And it is this beautiful order and this beautiful balance in nature that we study. And the third thing is to elaborate more on living things. What exactly is a living thing? In other words, what are the characteristics of living things? And how come viruses are not living? And finally, we shall finish the chapter by talking about how biology is studied. And this will lead us to the scientific method. So we define biology. The second order of business is that we appreciate that there's a certain order and balance in nature. Contrary to what most people believe, organisms, living things in the environment, are not in a constant survival of the fittest battle. In fact, most living things in the environment live in peaceful harmony. Clearly, of course, there's predator-prey relationship, and that's pretty intense sometimes. But in general, most living things leave other living things alone. There is order, and also there is a balance in nature. In other words, that all these living things are interdependent. That is, what happens to one of them affects another. And that's another very important concept of biology. Not only is the natural environment exceptionally organized, it is also very interdependent. What happens to one species affects others. So to appreciate this order and balance, I shall give you some examples. Here are some leafcutter ants. They're pretty curious creatures, in fact. What they do is they cut the leaves and they carry them leaves to their nest. They don't eat the leaves. What they do is they chew the leaves into little moist balls, and then they allow fungus to grow on these balls, and then they eat the fungus. In other words, these leafcutter ants, they're fungus feeders, and they farm the fungus. They're farmers. Quite remarkable. And notice, of course, that they work as a team. So this is just one example that if you look a little deeper, a little closer, and you feed your curiosity, you'll appreciate that there's great order and there are great mysteries that you can solve in the natural world. Here's another example. This is an insect eating pitcher plant. Don't get too scared because it's the size of your thumb. The insect eating pitcher plant has these little hairs. Now these insect eating carnivorous plants, they're very clever. They have these little hairs over here. And insects, which can hang on walls and ceilings, they can't hang on to these little hairs. They're so slippery and they fall right here, over here, and they're digestive juices, and the plant just absorbs them. How does this little plant know how to do that? How does it know how to make those little hairs? Here are some more examples of how living things seem to be particularly adapted to their environment. This is a leaf-tailed gecko. It's perfectly, beautifully camouflaged amongst the leaves. How does the gecko know, first of all, to camouflage itself like this? How did that happen? And number two, how does it know that if it camouflages like that, that it will not be eaten by its predator? How does that come about? And look at this owl. It's perfectly camouflaged in the tree. See, owls are nocturnal creatures, so during the daytime they want to kind of rest and chill, and they do not want to be disturbed, or they do not want to be seen. So they camouflage themselves. How does it know to do that? A second aspect of this is that species are interdependent. To give you an example, consider these honeybees. Now honeybees are pollinators. Apparently in the 1990s, there was a decline in the pollinator population, which jeopardized certain crops such as fruit-bearing trees. So as a result, what happened is the farmers didn't do so well, and the prices of fruits and groceries, etc., in the friendly neighborhood grocery store went up, all because there were not enough pollinators in that season. So you can see something that happens to a small creature can have a profound effect in your own life. Now this is just a very small example, but considering global climate change, etc., you can understand how dramatic changes in species, population, etc., and extinctions can profoundly affect our own lives. So biology as a science perhaps is more important now than it was ever before. Okay, so thus far I have defined for you the term biology, meaning it's the study of life or living things. And I've also suggested to you by giving examples that there is an order and balance in nature, and that is the principal business of the study of biology. The next topic that we shall discuss is what exactly are living things and how do we define them and what are the characteristics of living things. So if I was with you, I would in fact ask you to chart out what you think are some important characteristics of living things, and we would explore this together. But for the moment, since I do not have the privilege of your company, I'm going to state to you the characteristics of living things. 1. Living things have a very orderly structure. In other words, the composition of rock is very different from the composition of a bacteria. There's no comparison. The complexity of a bacteria cannot even be compared to the complexity of a rock. It would be quite insulting to the bacteria, even though a rock might contain on top of it 1,000 bacteria. But the bacteria are by far much more complicated than inorganic matter such as a rock. So living things have a very orderly structure. Secondly, living things grow. Even a bacteria, when it's born, it grows by a little bit, although not by much, but it grows. A tree grows. You grow. And thirdly, living things reproduce. All living things come from other living things. That's one of the most fundamental paradigms and fundamental statements of biology. That is, all living things come from other living things. And finally, something that might not be directly intuitive to you, and perhaps one of the most important concepts here, is that all living things interact and adjust to changes in their environment. And this is critical. See, a rock doesn't interact with its environment. If you touch a rock, it doesn't know that you're touching it. all living things, great and small, interact with the changes in their environment. Not only just interact, but they adjust the changes in their environment. See, a virus is able to do many of these things, except that it cannot reproduce on its own. Viruses cannot reproduce on their own. They have to infect other cells. They have to hijack other cells' machinery to be able to reproduce themselves. So they are imperfect in that sense. But even if you were to give them credit, cut some slack that, okay, fine, they eventually reproduce, right? But they do not interact, and they do not adjust to changes in their environment like other living things. If you were to leave a virus on the table, it would just sit there and not do anything. If a wind blows, it may just blow with the wind, right? So it does not sense its environment. So you can see how a virus is deficient in some of the fundamental characteristics of living things. To give you an example of orderly structure, look at this. This is bacteria with the flagellum. Not all bacteria have flagella, this little tail, but this bacteria does. And this flagellum is not to be underestimated if you were to look closely. It is made of multiple subunit proteins arranged in a very complex, delicate, and beautiful fashion, which come together to give you this amazing structure that is the flagellum. So, even something as simple as the flagellum of a bacteria or a sperm, for example, is quite complex, very symmetrical, and beautiful, and very logical. So all living things have a very orderly structure, including this little flagellum of this bacteria. Another great example is the structure of DNA. DNA is a beautiful structure, and in fact, when Watson and Crick first elucidated its structure in 1953, they looked at the model that they had created and they said, this had to be right. This had to be right. And the reason they said it had to be right is because to them it was so beautiful. Second characteristics of living thing is that they grow. And thirdly, as demonstrated here by the prairie dogs, they reproduce. Reproduction is essential for the survival of the species. If a species does not reproduce, that's the end of the species. So all living things come from other living things. So living things reproduce. Now I've used the term species already several times without defining it. It's very, very, very important. It's one of the most important definitions that you need to know. Alright, so species definition has two parts. First, species is a group of living things, group of organisms that are able to interbreed. In other words, they're able to come together and mate. So a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed. But that's not the end of it. They must produce offspring, and not just offspring. They must produce offsprings that are fertile. That is, their offspring must be able to produce the next generation thereafter. Otherwise, what's the point of producing offspring if that's like the end of your line? So a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. For example, see, horses and donkeys, they are two separate species. Horses and donkeys, they're two separate species. They can interbreed and produce mules. All the mules that are produced are a result of this crossbreeding. They themselves are infertile. They cannot produce the next generation. Therefore, although horses and donkeys can interbreed, there are two separate species. And finally, this last concept here, that species interact and adapt to their environment. See, these two bears have evolved very differently from each other. The reason for that is they live in two very different environments. For them to adapt, they must sense the changes in their environment. One is hiding from the winter, the other one loves winter, so to speak, right? This leads us to our final discussion topic. It's a basic concept, but one of the most important concepts in biology, and that is the stimulus-response phenomenon. See, all living things are able to interact with their environment means this. One, if there is something in the environment that is a change, that's called a stimulus. If something happens in their environment that affects the living organism, then the living organism will respond to it. The question is, why does it respond in the first place? Well, that's very important, because living things need to survive, and their responses are not trivial. Their responses are meant to protect their survival. So if you touch a roly-poly, it rolls. The reason is because it was protecting itself. So the responses that occur are not random. The responses that occur are to protect the living thing. For example, if somebody touches a hot pan, the immediate reflex response is to just let go of it. So the stimulus here was the heat of the pan, and the response from the living thing was to let go of the pan. So this is an example of stimulus-response phenomenon that is common to all living things, and this is how they interact with their environment in self-preservation. Deciduous trees, that is, trees that shed leaves during the fall, they actually respond to the length of the daylight and the temperature changes that occur. So there's a stimulus, there's a change in environment, the daylight length and the temperature change that drive the phenomenon that's behind the seasons. And this leads us to the concept of homeostasis. The term homeostasis, the first term, homeo means the same, stasis means state. Homeostasis means same state, or maintain the same state. Homeostasis, if you were to define it, you would say the regulation of an organism's internal environment to maintain conditions suitable for its survival. So all living things, from bacteria to plants to frogs to fishes to human beings, we have to maintain a certain internal environment so that we can survive. Our enzymes don't work if it's very hot. Our enzymes don't work if it's very cold. So we maintain internal environment. We maintain a particular pH, a particular temperature, particular salinity in our blood, for example, so that it can function properly. So this concept of maintaining a relatively stable internal environment is called homeostasis, and this is a definition also that you must know. I'll give you an example. When it gets cold, you shiver. The reason for that is when the body temperature falls, we have receptors that detect the temperature fall, and they send that information to the brain. And the brain then sends nerve impulses to muscles, which cause them to shiver, which generates heat. So the decline in body temperature results in shivering because muscles, when we shiver, we generate heat, which maintains our internal environment. So regulation of body temperature is an example of homeostasis. So the stimulus here is the fall in skin and blood temperature. And there are temperature receptors that generate nerve impulses to the brain, so the brain knows, oh, it looks like I'm getting cold. And then the brain then, in this case the hypothalamus, sends nerve impulses to pertinent organs, muscles, and blood vessels, interacting with the environment, and a gradual change in the species over time is what scientists define as evolution. So in conclusion, I have defined for you the term biology. I have suggested there is order and balance in nature. We've also explored some characteristics of living things. And next time, inshallah, we shall talk about how biology is studied and the scientific method. Until then, as-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.